The topic of the following block is, I believe, extremely relevant and important, and it is related to the influence of new technology and its broader implications for society and for democracy. Before we get to the talking, we will start somewhat differently than what you might expect, because the Institute would like to present to you its 5th translated and published book, which we will ceremoniously baptize right at the start of this block. The book is called The Technological Republic, with the subtitle Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West. And we are extremely happy that we can have with us here today one of the authors. Perhaps you can get an autograph later on if you manage to find him. His name is Nicholas Zamiska. He's the head of corporate affairs and a legal counsel in the office of the CEO of Palantir Technologies. He's also a member of the board of directors of the Palantir Foundation for Defense Policy and International Affairs. I'm really looking forward to talking to him. But before we sit down with Nicholas, I would like to invite to the stage him as well as Karol Janeček and Jan Hořeňovský, the director of the Institute, who will ceremoniously pop a bottle of champagne or Bohemia sect, I'm not quite sure, and will baptize the book. So, gentlemen. Do we have the book? Oh, yeah. Okay, by the way, this is the book, Jan, if you can show it. And you can buy it right at the stall on my right, on your left-hand side. So here it comes. Okay, so I hereby declare the book launched. So. Cheers. Okay, and let's let's talk about what the book is about. Hi again, Nicholas.
Yes, hello.
Welcome to Prague. How have you been enjoying your stay here?
Just so pleased to be here, and thank you to everyone, to the foundation for publishing this book. You all should know that Adam is not merely my interlocutor here. He is the translator of this book into Czech and is bringing this treatise, this tome, hopefully.
Manifesto, almost, I would say. It's
yeah, better to have others say it's a manifesto rather than ourselves. But certainly a work that we believe in and we think is an important contribution. And just so glad that it is going to reach a Czech audience. We're grateful for that.
No, I would definitely recommend the book. I think it's full of insights that I honestly haven't heard anywhere else. And it certainly doesn't really fit into the sort of corporate literature genre, even though it was written by people from a company. And that's actually my first question, because in the book you don't focus too much on Palantir. It's more about sort of broader societal issues, especially in the West, and the challenges for Western civilization. However, it does seem to stem from a particular culture and particular history of the company, which is Palantir. And I know that Palantir was working in Afghanistan in identifying explosive devices that were killing soldiers. I know that the English National Health Services runs on your software. Alex Karp, the CEO, was, for example, the first Western CEO to meet with President Zelensky. But I would guess that most people here don't really know what Palantir really does. So before we get to the book, could you perhaps describe how you started and what is it that you exactly do?
Absolutely. Palantir was founded in 2003 in Palo Alto, California, and really got its start, I would say, working with the US Special Forces in Afghanistan, for instance, helping soldiers in the US and with allied nations as well predict the placement of roadside bombs. This was a data challenge in no uncertain terms, and we deployed our software across the country, I think to great effect. And it turns out that a lot of the challenges that a defense or intelligence company faces are no different than a healthcare company, for instance. A tangle of data, too much, too many silos, too many barriers, not a way to functionally integrate that data while maintaining the privacy and legal restrictions that govern the use of that data. So we very quickly pivoted and have a broad swath of commercial customers across sectors: healthcare, aviation, energy, oil and gas, insurance, and further afield. So that was the start. We're essentially just over 20 years old at this point.
What many people say is that Palantir is one of the dominant players when it comes to the application of artificial intelligence. And I don't think there has been a more popular or more more discussed topic in the past year or two than AI and its influence. And most people nowadays would probably imagine LLMs like ChatGPT or Grok or Gemini and so on. Do you think this is the future of the technology? And when it comes to the bold predictions that many people have when it comes to AI, is it just hype, or are we really having a fourth industrial revolution on our hands? What do you think?
Well, it is the question of the moment. I do think LLMs represent a completely discontinuous and remarkable advance in the form of artificial intelligence as we know it. They are, in some ways they appear magical, but they also require something else, and that's a foundational data architecture to make them useful. I think one good example, I came across an airline maintenance workflow. If you're trying to maintain a fleet of airplanes and you need to replace a part, and you need to think about who's qualified to replace that particular part on those particular aircraft with regard to planes flying around a country, a national airline, for example, you need the schedule information, you need the part information, you need to think about where the part's coming from, whether it's backlog, maybe what the cost is, what truck it's on. Then you have to think about the technicians. Are they qualified to work on that particular part? Now, also, I saw this wrinkle in this actual workflow. What about, have they taken vacation recently? So all of a sudden, you have the LLM, which now you can ask common sense, plain language questions of, what engineers are most qualified to work on this part at this time, and in a way that might not disrupt schedules. Yet, for the LLM to do anything remotely useful with that query, you need to point it to specific data sets that are the most reliable, canonical data sets that the company has. What is the latest schedule, vacation information? Who's taken vacation days? Where is the latest certification information for those engineers? What parts are we talking about? What parts matter most? What parts are most likely to disrupt the operations of my airline? And all of a sudden you have, I think, a good example of the ways in which LLMs, when married with the foundational infrastructure that we have built over the course of 2 decades, can really do something useful and do something much more interesting and I think compelling than kind of the chat interface that was our first exposure to what I do believe is a remarkable technology.
I've heard the view that LLMs will become almost like a commodity, they will be used by other companies, applied across different infrastructure that will be built around them. Would you agree with that view? This sort of commoditization of the language models?
I do think they quickly became commoditized in one sense. We have workflows for an insurance company, for instance, where there are dozens of different LLMs working on different segments of that workflow, for instance, an underwriting process. And the analogy I use is, why drive the Ferrari to work if the Volvo will get you there? A lot of this is about cost, the cost it takes to use the LLMs. GPT is fabulous, but clients in certain circumstances don't need that level of cutting edge technology for the purpose at hand.
Coming back to the book itself, because it really does deal with more broader themes related to our culture as the West, and where to go with it, we just talked about the AI, and one thing that really did strike me in the book is that you talk about the so-called winner's fallacy that we might be suffering under in the West, namely that we might believe that just because we won World War II and the Cold War, that we will just keep on automatically winning the future challenges. And you say that this is an assumption that is not to be taken for granted, especially in the current race. For who is going to dominate the new technology. So do you think, is there a reason to be really worried? And is there a possible Cold War #2 on the horizon?
Well, I couldn't agree more that it's this period of, I wouldn't say peace, but some form of geopolitical stasis, even stalemate among the great powers since 1945 is a remarkable achievement that should absolutely not be taken for granted. It has been, 80 years and a month now since the last time a nuclear weapon was used in war, since August of 1945 in Japan. And while we read the headlines, while there is tremendous conflict and certainly tragedy in this world, entire generations now, probably 2 or 3, have never known a world war, have never known a conflict between the great powers, essentially. Billions of people and billions of their children and grandchildren have never known this horror. And I do think that American power, to a great extent, has been, unfashionable as it has been at times, has been part of that story, guarding that fragile, albeit very valuable piece. And the extent to which we can further invest in defense is our best hope, I think, of making sure that 80 years turns into something longer, turns into a century.
As an insider of the tech industry and somebody who works very closely and sees the development of AI and its application even in defense, sees it from a very close distance, how does the West compare to a country like China, for example? Like, if we look at it as an arms race, are we ahead? Is it neck to neck? What do you think?
I think we have enormous advantages. We shouldn't take them for granted, but there are real advantages. We looked at the top 50 technology companies on the planet. 86% of that market cap as of, last year or so was in the United States. That's essentially $9 out of every 10 of big tech market cap coming from the US. Why is that? That's a long conversation. I think there are a lot of reasons that drive that, but we also have challenges. One example that comes to mind is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. This is the premier, the premier fighter jet of the age, conceived of under President Clinton in the mid-1990s in the United States. And Mark Milley reminded us relatively recently, this jet, this single product costs $2 trillion with a T, trillion. And its end of useful life is 2088. And Milley made the great point. What do we think are the odds that a manned fighter jet is going to be winning the skies in 2088? I think you and I know the answer to that question. It's
going to be drones.
Absolutely. And yet there's this century-long product development cycle. At Palantir, this is foreign. Foreign doesn't even do it justice. Alien. We try to iterate not in a century, 50 years, 20 years, 2 years. We try to iterate with our software in 2 months, 2 weeks, sometimes even 2 days. So how can we get those product development cycles down? Hardware is different, yes, but that I think is not necessary. That approach will not necessarily guarantee us the dominance that the U.S. and our allies in Europe, including the Czech Republic and elsewhere, enjoyed in the 20th century. To ensure that level of dominance in the 21st, we need to pivot, and very briskly. The only thing I'll add to that is that the spending on software, we have a horse in the race, so take what I say with a grain of salt, but it needs to increase. As of a year or two ago, the U.S. has a roughly $900 billion defense budget, probably edging towards $1 trillion a year now. 0.2% of that was spent on AI, not 5%, but a fifth of 1%. Yes, it's crept up, it's moving in the right direction, but the steel, the planes and tanks that really, won the last century will not be what wins the next. And I think the countries that pivot most briskly can play an outsized role, whether it's a Poland, a Czech Republic, an Argentina. Some middleweight players, I think, could be really formidable leaders in this next century in a way that we probably wouldn't have expected even a few years ago, if they invest in what really matters and moves the needle.
I think the war in Ukraine really opened eyes for many people about the change in the style of warfare, because when you look at the Ukrainian front, you can see that it is very much drone heavy, and this is, yes, when you talk to reporters who visit the places, they talk about how this is actually the biggest threat for soldiers at the moment. Has there been a change of sentiment both in America and in Europe, that there is perhaps this new kind of technological, more autonomous, more software-based kind of warfare on the horizon, and we need to get ready for that?
Absolutely. There has been a shift in the United States, and I think elsewhere. We see tech leaders in the Oval Office. We see tech leaders working with government leaders. But I do think that some of those optics mask the sheer volume of talent and capital in the United States in particular that still is rushing to what we would describe as the consumer internet. This is the ecosystem of apps and services that powers our lives. Look, everyone in this room has an iPhone in their pocket, maybe two. And the apps are wondrous. It's a wondrous invention. We all use them. But should that be the crowning achievement of our civilization or culture? And I think the book certainly makes the case that, yes, the iPhone and that consumer ecosystem that started this current era of innovation should be the beginning of the story, but not the end. Shouldn't we see the greatest technology of our time, artificial intelligence, certainly deployed to higher stakes challenges in national security, public education, local law enforcement, any number of domains, medical research, the food delivery, empires and the social media empires, I think may have been the beginning of the story, but we hope are not the last.
The reason why I called it a manifesto right at the start of your book is because I think this is one of the very prominent calls to action that you make in the book is the idea of the, how would I put it, a sort of misplacement of talent when you have the best and brightest, the most intelligent people in the world working on things that are essentially trivial, and you do appeal to these people to start orienting themselves to something a bit more important. And what I really found particularly intriguing was that you talk about how we've sort of forgotten to talk about national interest, or we failed to find a form of collective identity. I think that's the phrase that you use, that would induce in people any kind of moral resonance, any sort of striving for something higher than the sort of short-termism of consumer products. And you quote Michael Sandel, fundamentalists rush in where liberals fear to tread, that the sort of liberal tendency is to be very, very wary when it comes to national interest and collective identity. And I think a lot of people, if they heard it, it would make them feel quite nervous, yet you feel it is something that we've lost and that we perhaps need to get back somehow. How would you respond to these people?
This is something where I think you and I are, quite aligned about. In fundamentalists, it's fundamentalists on the left and the right, religious and otherwise, rush in where liberals, small l, fear to tread, I would say. Our reticence of constructing or reinforcing or supporting some growth of a national consciousness or national identity or even collective identity has had costs. Inclusion is an uncontroversially necessary good. No one is going to argue that. But I think in the United States and the West more broadly, we forgot to ask inclusion into what? What is the whole into which we aspire to include someone else? We became so reticent to define that boundary, emotionally almost, that we favored kind of a vacant and neutered pluralism at the expense of something rich and compelling. So I think we can marry those twin goals of inclusion, but also having a robust sense of what values we want to defend. In the book, we leave that open, but that's the next stage of this discussion. I also think that the proponents of that, what I would describe as sort of that vacant neutrality, fail to realize that in the absence of our interest in defending the collective, the market will decide. The market will rush in, to your question. The market will decide what ought to be built. And do we want to kneel at the altar of the market? You know, should we not have a say in whether our best and brightest minds, and possibly more importantly, the money that chases them, what they're building, what is their best use of their talents working on the next social media video sharing thing? You know, I think we could all agree no. The market will speak where we fail to speak. The other thing I'll mention is, with that lack of discussion about what we ought to be building and why, you have a generation of very talented people drift into a small subset of industries. A recent class at Harvard, 41% of these students are going into one of two industries, finance and consulting. Yes, these are vital industries. We need this. We need these sectors. This is up from 7% in the 1970s, so 7% to the 40%, essentially half the class doing one of two things. Is that the best sort of allocation of our shared resources? We would argue no.
Perhaps one thing that may be linked to the phenomenon, you also talk about how since we've lost these sort of perhaps grand narratives and collective identities, we've focused quite a lot on sort of the, how would I say it, like sort of the rule of procedures and things like transparency and rule following and so on, which may have contributed to the fact that, and this, by the way, was a phenomenon that has been described quite recently in the Czech debate as well, because we have parliamentary elections very soon. And many commentators noticed that we, in a way, are lacking great personalities and great leaders, and everything is sort of, vanilla, mediocre, not very interesting, not very inspiring. And in the book, you also talk about particular individuals that really made a difference in the past. Like one that really stuck with me was the Rear Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear submarine, and who really tipped the balance of power during Cold War. But you describe him as somewhat quirky, unorthodox, but also extremely efficient and important for the program of the nuclear submarine. And then you mentioned that that he probably wouldn't be able to operate in the current environment. So what drove that change? And perhaps can you say a little bit more about Rickover or perhaps other such examples?
Absolutely. The story of Hyman Rickover, I think, and there are many stories like his, but his story is particularly resonant. He was a very senior commander in the U.S. Navy. Former President Jimmy Carter actually served underneath him, and he was this kind of irascible guy, problematic. I think most of us would describe him as essentially abusive in the modern parlance. He would make junior officers stand in the closet. He would say he would burn the Navy rule book, and he really lashed out. Some degree of self-awareness as well was combined with that interpersonal difficulty. In a 1984 interview with Diane Sawyer, he had this great line. He said, I know I have the charisma of a chipmunk. And yet, Admiral Rickover, by all accounts, was the father of the American nuclear navy. He took Oppenheimer's invention, which came to us, from the 30s and 40s, the nuclear reactor, and shrunk it, made this thing smaller so it could fit on a submarine. They actually tested it in Idaho, the smaller version of it. It worked, and they put it on a sub. And now you have a sub that can stay submerged not for days, but weeks and months, and provided the U.S. and its allies with an enormous advantage over the Soviets for decades, and now certainly half a century and more, an advantage that persists to this day. The story continues, though, because Rickover even though by all accounts he was, gave us the nuclear navy and really ensured American and Allied dominance over the oceans for the 20th century. He had some enemies, and it turns out in the early 1980s, it emerged, reported in the New York Times and, the whole sort of front page treatment, that he had been accepting gifts from General Dynamics, which was, the premier shipbuilder of the age. And the roster of gifts was kind of odd. It was, cutlery and mugs and, dry cleaning for his suits. And yes, there was a necklace for his wife. So kind of this odd mixed grab bag of items, but amounted to real dollars over the course of a dozen plus years. And this was really used by his enemies as his fall from grace. And in the book, and I, just to emphasize it here, I do think that the story is a cautionary tale for our culture. What incentives do we create for our leaders? How risk averse do we want them to be? Is there no room for forgiveness or for some tolerance of, the contradictions of the human mind and our imperfections? We're all flawed creatures. And I can say that every day of the week, I would take a nuclear submarine and half a century of dominance over the Soviets, and I would give him a pass on his vanity, his error in judgment. But I do not want to incentivize the next generation of leaders to be so risk averse. We want them to do the right thing, but we have this illusion in the US certainly, and in Europe as well, that our leaders should be our priests. But results also need to matter.
When talking about incentives, there also seems to be a great asymmetry when it comes to the responsibility and power that our elected leaders or other parts of the government have, and how they're being rewarded. I think you mentioned Jerome Powell, probably the most powerful man in the world when it comes to global finances, whose salary equates to that of a fairly junior analyst in an investment bank, right? And you talk about Singapore as a perhaps an example of a country where you can actually incentivize the sort of costs and benefits when it comes to government leaders that would work in a better way. Can you tell us more about Singapore, or even about these sort of strange incentive structure, even when it comes to the rewards?
Well, the question and the theme builds on Rickover's story. I think we need to pay our public servants more. From my vantage, I do think that the government sector should be even more voracious in incorporating the culture, and the culture of Silicon Valley includes real incentives into the operation of government. I do think there are odd contradictions that result when you pay public servants what we pay them, and really give them reason to monetize their position often before they take office or after, instead of getting rewarded for the life-saving vital work that they're doing while they're in elected office, essentially. So, Singapore was unfashionable in its adoption of very significant salaries for government ministers for a while, but I do think we should reconsider our assumptions about how incentives can play a role in the public sector. Absolutely.
And Singapore was also very unapologetic when it comes to building national identity, right?
Absolutely, with national service, the adoption of language policies, and was sort of less than shy about trying to stitch together some degree of national identity from a very diverse and small fledgling nation. And I think a success by any stretch of the imagination.
You mentioned Silicon Valley, and what I quite like about your discussion of Silicon Valley in the book is that you're almost ambivalent about the whole topic, because on one hand you're very critical about the culture, the misplacement of talent and so on, but on the other hand you actually see quite a lot of potential when it comes to what you call the engineering mindset, and something that we can actually learn from and applied to governments or perhaps to the broader culture of the West. What is the engineering mindset?
You can call it many things, but I think it's a flexible organizational culture. At Palantir, we try to de-emphasize signs and signifiers of status internally. We're very loosely organized. And I think we generally underestimate the amount of excitement that those patches of blank space in a company or an institution can create for young, ambitious, talented people to put their hand up and say, I want to do this. If you don't know who's leading, commercial sales in Scandinavia, maybe you're more likely to put your hand up and say, I want to do that. So I think American companies have really gotten something right here. The behemoth sort of layered senior vice president system, the pyramid structures of the past, are not building the most cutting edge technology of the next decade, absolutely. And I think we just have to remain nimble and stay focused on results, and be tolerant of the less than charismatic personalities among us. The Rickovers, for example, in some corporate institutions would be very quickly weeded out. But I think there needs to be a place for people whose ambitions and interests are aligned with the institution and publics they serve, but may misstep from time to time. And some degree of tolerance for error is a vital part of building something new.
The book very much talks about America. However, you always add America and its allies in Europe and elsewhere. When I look at the development of the tech world, it seems clear that Europe has been tragically lagging behind when it comes to any development. Most of the tech scene is in the United States. Is there something that you would recommend to us, Europeans?
No recommendations, but I think this conversation's already started in earnest, and it's about defense spending. It's one we're all familiar with. The U.S., since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, has been spending 3 to 5%. And this is an investment that has continued to compound. And I don't want us to take that compounding investment for granted, the benefits it can have. Europe, by contrast, we know what the numbers are. It's, since 89 hovered around 1.5%. It's creeping up, and there's real support here and elsewhere for getting those numbers up. But we not only need to consider the amount of spending, but what we're spending it on. Is it the next F-35 Joint Strike Fighter? Or is it the drone swarm, the targeting system, the AI that will really command the battlefield in the way that we hope it will? I just think, some degree of shared or more alignment about spending and the objects of that spending is absolutely vital to get this right as the transatlantic partnership, moves into this next era.
Nicholas, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. Just to let you know, we've only touched on very small subset of the themes in the book because it's something over 200 pages, but it is very packed. I think we discussed it yesterday. We have fairly short amount of time for just a couple of questions, and I'll Honza Hořeňovský,
Thank you. Nicholas, I know that you are a lawyer. What's your point of view about European AI Act? Do you think that it is something that can protect Europe and civil liberties, or do you see it something that cannot protect civil liberties and also harm our technology sectors and our ability to come up with the best AI that is possible? Thank you.
It's the right question, and we're thinking about regulation in the United States as well. What I will say is that we should be open to regulation in all contexts, but I do think we need to calibrate our risk tolerance based on the sectors in which we are operating. If we're thinking about the next social media platform, my tolerance for risk drops precipitously. Guardrails, yes. Another kind of video sharing app is not an essential service to our culture, our nation, our civilization. When we're operating in the context of national security, counterterrorism, but also medical research, oncology research, my risk appetite increases very significantly. And I think we just need to make sure that regulations are context dependent and aware of the eventual objects of our technological progress. So, our software is used across Europe, in the counterterrorism context, for instance. Bombs have not gone off because of the use of our software platforms there. We should proceed cautiously, but you have to balance that caution against what you're trying to achieve.
Professor
Thank you. I just wanted to put your discussion in the context of the conference theme. All of this sounds very sunny, but I'm at a loss about how democracy is saved. I mean, clearly, we've just, this seems like a very good outline for a total empowerment of government to essentially rob all of us of our privacy. I think, just to draw a name out of the hat, Peter Thiel can find out anything about me that he wants. Just to draw a name out of the hat. And all of the good news that we've just heard sounds to me like it's as much good news for the worst autocracies as for any democracy. I don't hear anything distinctly democratic. I don't hear how democracy comes out better off. I mean, I guess maybe in a loose sense you say, well, democracies have free markets and free markets spur greater tax bases and all that. But I mean, leaving that aside, because I think China can belie a lot of this. It's just not clear to me, what is the clear gain for democracy and for democratic citizens and the protections of their civil liberties? What keeps them absolutely guaranteed, even against Peter Thiel?
What I will say is, I think the technology industry lost a lot of trust in its first era of pursuit of the consumer internet and the applications that we were discussing. In the book we write, free email is not enough. If you are going to be entrusted to be part of our lives in the way that all the large tech companies are, you need to be delivering something of substance. So to your question, though, I do think concerns are justified, skepticism is warranted. And I do think this next chapter will need to build that connective tissue. We see these leaders in not only the Oval Office, but across government. These tech leaders, these are unelected heads of privately held companies. They're not subject to the accountability in the way that our elected officials are. So that connective tissue, if we get anything right, will be built in this next chapter. It currently doesn't exist, but it's certainly a challenge and a vital one ahead. But hope that's helpful.
Right. Well, thanks for your questions. We're out of time, unfortunately, but Nicholas, thanks again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.